Hey everyone, welcome into our first version of the Fireside Chats for 2016. Today we spent a lot of time looking at politics in the Civil War, most notably the three pieces of legislation that came out of 1862. And then of course we had the election of 1864 where we saw Lincoln defeat McClellan narrowly in the popular vote, but quite severely in the electoral vote. Now, speaking of 1864, also keep in mind what I said towards the end of class, the controversy of Lincoln introducing into Congress the 13th Amendment, which would eventually lead to the abolition of slavery. But as far as the war is concerned, 1864 marks a turning point in the North's strategy. Now, shortly after Gettysburg, Lincoln appointed Ulysses S. Grant as the overall commander of the Union Army. And eventually Grant moved into back east because he was fighting out west. And Grant would command the Union Army through the rest of the war. And 1864 is really when the war started to forever shift away from the South, who had been tenuously holding on to its advantage, but started to see that slip after Gettysburg and, of course, Vicksburg as well out west. 1864, Grant devised a new strategy. The war had been fought now for over 3 years, and Grant's new strategy was going to be that the North would engage the South in what was known as total war. Now, total war is a brutal, and I mean brutal, method of fighting. And in future wars like World War II, total war was enacted quite successfully and quite brutally as well. But in total war, the goal is for one side to essentially decimate the other with as many loss of life and casualties as possible. Grant's strategy called for the Union to completely break the back, both both literally and figuratively of the South. And what I mean by break the South's back was Grant wanted to ensure that the South could no longer support the war effort economically, financially, and with supplies. Total war sometimes includes the destruction of civilian population. However, that was not part of the North's agenda here in their version of total war. They wanted to simply destroy the South's will to fight the rest of the war. And so when you hear that term total war in the context of the Civil War, you want to make sure you realize it comes down to defeating the South's will to fight. So I'm going to give you guys a few examples of how this total war played out from 1864 all the way to the end of the war. Maybe the best example of Grant's strategy of total war comes from an old ally of Grant, William Sherman. Remember, Sherman was the guy who Grant spoke to after the battle, the first day of Shiloh. We'll lick him tomorrow. You guys seem to enjoy that story. Sherman was tasked with about 60,000 Union troops to march and take the city of Atlanta, Georgia. Atlanta was the commercial, financial, and railroad hub of the South. So for the North to take Atlanta, that would have been a momentous change in the advantages of the North. And by September of 1864, this is right before Lincoln gets elected too, by the way, Sherman was successful in capturing Atlanta. And then Sherman and his men set out to really enact that total war strategy. Sherman's March to the Sea was a military movement from Atlanta, Georgia, all the way to Savannah, which is right on the coast of Georgia. And across that journey, Sherman's intentions were to destroy as much of the South as possible. And again, what do I mean by destroy? The Union Army burned, looted, pillaged village after village and town after town. They stole food. They destroyed tools. They burned homes. They took animals. They melted railroad tracks and tied them into bows that were called Sherman neckties. That's actually, look that up, Sherman neckties was a term on Sherman's March. This was a brutal yet incredibly successful march, and brutal, especially in the eyes of the South. Many Southerners who survived the war look back with great disdain for the way the Northern Army treated the Southern citizens during Sherman's march to the sea. But regardless, Sherman's march to the sea proved completely successful. And on Christmas Day, Sherman arrived Christmas Day 1864. Sherman arrived in Savannah and sent Abraham Lincoln a telegraph telling him that he would be presenting Lincoln with a Christmas present of the city of Savannah. And Sherman's March has really gone down and lived in the legacy of the Civil War. I mentioned how it's a very sore point in the South, but from a military strategy, it proved to be something quite unique that the North was not typically doing throughout most of the war. There's a lot of controversy to the fact that Sherman and his men took such strict liberties at punishing Southern civilians. Now, again, some civilians may have been killed, but most records indicate that the civilian casualties were quite low. But the strategy of the North at this point in the war was to break the will of the South. And by showing no mercy towards Southerners that were in the path of Sherman's army, the March to the Sea was a bold and stark contrast to previous Union strategies. And again, it really indicated that the North was going to take a sort of a new approach, a take no prisoners approach. And some military historians, you guys may have heard this term before, they call this method not just total war, but also a scorched earth policy, because literally Sherman's men burned everything they possibly could. And they didn't stop in Georgia. Eventually, they would move on up and capture the city of Charleston, South Carolina, and would practice the same exact strategies, burning and looting and stealing their way to victory after victory. Sherman's March was a really defining moment in the Civil War. And that's why I've been spending so much time on it. It truly defined late Northern strategy, and it also signified the changes in the way the war was being fought. But back north, total war was also being employed, but in a much different way. Sherman's men faced very little resistance. In fact, when he got to the city of Savannah, there were no Confederate soldiers there. They had all abandoned the city. So Sherman's march was met with very little resistance. Meanwhile, Grant back north and Lee were tussling against one another for the first time in the war. And Grant launched in 1864 what became known as the Overland Campaign. And the Overland Campaign was actually a really difficult process for the North and did not amount to immediate success as Grant had hoped. One of the misconceptions that students often make is that they think that because of the fact that Gettysburg was such a decisive victory for the North that the South more or less just crumbled, but that's not true at all. Lee and his soldiers, despite constantly being outnumbered for the last year of the war, put up incredibly stiff resistance. And the casualties that occurred in battles in the Overland Campaign, like the Battle of the Wilderness, the Battle of Spotsylvania, the Battle of Cold Harbor, these were some of the battles that involved more men than any battles yet, and some of the highest casualties outside of Gettysburg and Antietam, and some of the other battles like Fredericksburg, for example, that we discussed earlier. So I just want you guys to realize while listening to this that the end of the war was not swift. It took a long time to get to April 9th, 1865, when the South finally did surrender. And that process of the Overland Campaign, the total war strategy that was being employed both throughout Virginia and parts of the northern southern states, but also especially with Sherman in the very deep South, really eventually wore out the South. The decimation that occurred to the railroads and to the economy, eventually the South just could not sustain any longer. But before we talk about the South's surrender, I want to mention one last battle because it has an incredible and almost scary amount of foreshadow, and that's the Battle of Petersburg. Petersburg is a city just outside of Richmond, Virginia. And what's notable about Petersburg is that it was a 9-month engagement and in which Grant's army tried to capture the city from Lee and his forces. And what is eerily foreshadowing about the siege of Petersburg was the fact that it's one of the few examples of trench warfare during the Civil War. And as you guys know from last year's study, 50 years later, trench warfare is going to break out to absolute chaos on the fronts of Russia and France in World War I. So Petersburg is an example of the brutality of warfare that is coming in the 20th century. But obviously at this point, that remains something in the future. So a quick recap before we talk about the last segment. The shift in strategy for the North was to move towards a total war, destroying the psychological will of the South and also their economic and physical will by destroying their means of productions, destroying railroads, destroying towns and villages. Total war examples were the Overland Campaign throughout Virginia, that eventually Grant was able to defeat Lee, but with high casualties on both sides. And then Sherman's March to the Sea is the epitome of this total war strategy in the Deep South. Eventually, Grant would wear Lee down, and the total war strategy did pay off. But like I said, at very high costs. And on April 9th, 1865, Lee met Grant at a courthouse in the town of Appomattox Courthouse. And that is where Robert E. Lee officially surrendered the war. Perhaps it was a sign of mutual respect. Perhaps it was the acknowledgement that both armies were American. But Grant did not require Lee to surrender his sword nor his horse, who by the way, the horse's name was Traveler. Lee kept his horse and his sword, and that was typically unique. That almost never happened in war. But Appomattox, the surrender at Appomattox was the end of the Civil War. And if you're wondering about dates, and that's also my sister's birth date. So every year that she increases in age, I always like to remind her that she's was born on the anniversary of the South surrender. I'm going to put some things in broader context tomorrow, and it's not going to be pretty, but we're going to look at some of the death tolls that the whole war cost, and then look at the financial burden as well. So it's not going to be pretty, but it's important we look at these things because we're then going to transition and really wrap up the war itself on tomorrow. So taking everything into account, 1864 was a really important year in the Civil War, not just because of the political changes, but also the strategy changes in the war. Hard fought all the way to the end. The South was relentless in its pursuit to maintain its autonomy, but in the end, the North just overwhelmed the South with manpower, munitions, supplies, the industrial complex, and Lee's forces surrendered. So that's it for tonight. I hope you guys have enjoyed getting back in the swing of things. I plan on continuing to do these every week. Money, you can see, is over there on the couch. He does not seem that enthralled over my shoulder there. And Homer, I'm not even going to show you what Homer's doing because he is just sprawled out on the couch. And so hopefully you guys enjoyed this a little more than they did. Have a good evening. I'll see you guys in class tomorrow.